The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the linoleum floor of Margaret's small apartment in Chicago's Garfield Ridge neighborhood. She pressed the pale yellow blouse against the ironing board, the same one 7-year-old Lucy had once said made her look like sunshine grandma. The fabric was worn thin from years of careful washing, but Margaret treasured it. It was her armor for the precious Tuesday afternoons when she collected her granddaughter from Lincoln Elementary. The shrill ring of the telephone shattered the peaceful silence. Margaret's weathered hands trembled as she reached for the receiver, an inexplicable dread settling in her chest like ice water. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Officer Rodriguez from the B. 8th District. Your granddaughter has been detained at Morrison's Grocery. You need to come immediately." The words hit her like physical blows. Detained, 7 years old. Her Lucy, with her gap-toothed smile and worn teddy bear named Mr. Buttons, was in trouble. Margaret's legs gave way. She gripped the kitchen counter, her knuckles white against the faded formica. "What happened? Is she hurt?" "Just come down, ma'am. We'll explain everything when you get here." The grocery store buzzed with whispered conversations that died the moment Margaret entered. Eyes followed her every step. Suspicious, judgmental gazes that made her feel like she was the one who had committed some terrible crime. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh clinical glow. Lucy sat hunched on a metal folding chair near the customer service counter, her small frame dwarfed by the institutional furniture. Mr. Buttons was clutched, so tightly against her chest that his fur was matted with tears. Her usually bright eyes were reed-rimmed and vacant, staring at the scuffed linoleum beneath her pink sneakers. Store manager Frank Morrison approached with the swagger of a man drunk on his own authority. His badge gleamed under the harsh lights, and his mouth was set in a hard line of righteous indignation. "She stole from my store," he announced without preamble, his voice carrying across the crowded space. "Took food right off the shelf and walked out, gave it all to some vagrant outside." Margaret's world tilted. "She's 7 years old." "Old enough to know right from wrong," Morrison shot back. "Old enough to face consequences." The cruel words echoed in Margaret's mind as she knelt beside her granddaughter. Lucy flinched at her touch, a reaction that cut deeper than any physical pain Margaret had ever endured. The child who used to run into her arms was now afraid, broken by the weight of adult judgment. They wouldn't let her take Lucy home. Papers were filed, official charges drawn up against a first grader whose only crime was compassion. Margaret felt the world crumbling around her as she signed form after form, each signature another nail in. The coffin of her granddaughter's innocence. The police station smelled of disinfectant and despair. Margaret sat beside Lucy in the waiting area, desperate to bridge the chasm that had opened between them in just a few short hours. Other families waited too, teenagers with their heads down, parents with hollow eyes. But Lucy was the smallest among them, a child lost in an adult world that had no patience for kindness. "Can you tell me what happened, sweetheart?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the institutional hum of the building. Lucy's response was so quiet, Margaret had to lean in to hear it. "There was a man outside. He looked hungry, Grandma, like when I forgot to feed my goldfish and she... God, those sad eyes." Margaret's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. This beautiful, empathetic child had seen suffering and acted to alleviate it, only to be punished for her compassion. That evening, David arrived at Margaret's apartment like a storm front. Her son had inherited his father's temper, but none of his wisdom, and the years had hardened him into someone Margaret barely recognized. He burst through the door without knocking, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he shouted, his voice echoing off the modest walls of the apartment. "You fill her head with all this bleeding heart. Nonsense, and look what happens. She thinks she can just take whatever she wants." Margaret rose from the couch where Lucy was curled up, trying to make herself invisible. She was trying to help someone. She stole David's fist, crashed down on the kitchen table, making the salt and pepper shakers jump. She's going to have a record because you never taught her about consequences. The accusations came like bullets, each one finding its mark. Margaret had raised David alone after his father left, working 3 jobs to keep food on the table and clothes on his back. She had sacrificed her dreams, her youth, her own happiness to give him every opportunity. She could afford. I did the best I could, she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of years of unspoken resentment. Your best wasn't good enough, David spat. It never was. But what struck Margaret most deeply wasn't the cruelty of his words, it was how effortlessly they came, as if he'd been rehearsing them for years. The contempt in his voice revealed a truth she hadn't been prepared to face, somewhere along the way. The love between them had curdled into something toxic and unrecognizable. The juvenile court hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. In the days leading up to it, Lucy stopped eating more than a few bites at each meal. She returned to wetting the bed, a habit she'd outgrown months ago. The vibrant, curious child Margaret knew seemed to be fading before her eyes, replaced by a shadow who jumped at sudden noises and flinched from affection. Margaret called David, repeatedly begging him to intervene to stand up for his daughter. Each conversation ended the same way. She needs to learn that actions have consequences, he would say, his voice cold and inflexible. Maybe this will finally teach you both to stop living in your fairy tale world. The morning of the hearing, Margaret helped Lucy into her best dress, a blue one with small white flowers that she'd worn to her school's spring concert. The child's hand shook as Margaret braided her hair, and she kept asking the same question, over and over, "Am I going to jail, Grandma?" The juvenile courtroom was smaller than Margaret had expected, but no less intimidating. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across institutional furniture that had seen too many broken families and shattered dreams. Lucy sat between Margaret and the court-appointed attorney, her feet dangling from the adult-sized chair. Mr. Buttons clutched against her chest like a lifeline. When they called Lucy's name, it sounded like an indictment. The prosecutor, a stern woman in a severe black suit, painted the picture of a theft in broad strokes, making it sound as if Lucy had masterminded some elaborate criminal enterprise. The defendant knowingly removed merchandise from the store without payment, she intoned, consulting her notes with theatrical precision. When confronted, she fled the scene, showing clear awareness of her wrongdoing. Margaret wanted to scream. Fled, Lucy had walked with those tiny legs in pink sneakers that Margaret had bought with her Social Security check, walked to give food to a man who had nothing. Then, just as Margaret felt the last of her hope slipping away, something unexpected happened. The courtroom doors opened with a soft creak, and a man entered, tall, weathered, with clothes that were clean but worn. His presence changed the entire atmosphere of the room. He was the homeless man Lucy had fed. Judge Patricia Williams looked up from her papers, surprised by the interruption. "Can I help you, sir?" The man stepped forward, his voice steady despite the obvious nervousness in his posture. "Your Honor, I'd like to speak about what really happened that day, about what this little girl did for me." The judge gestured for him to approach the witness stand. As he walked past their table, Lucy looked up at him with recognition dawning in her eyes. For the first time in days, she sat up straighter. "Please state your name for the record," the judge said. "Thomas Mitchell." "Your Honor, I was a high school history teacher for 15 years before—" His voice caught slightly. "Before my life fell apart." The courtroom fell silent. Even the prosecutor leaned forward, her prepared arguments momentarily forgotten. Thomas cleared his throat and continued. "I lost my job when my wife got cancer. Used up our savings on treatments that didn't work. Lost our house. Lost her. Lost myself for a while after that." His hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. "I've been living on the streets for 2 years. In that time I've been ignored, cursed at, spit on, and treated like I'm less than human." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. Beside her, Lucy was listening intently, her young mind trying to process the weight of adult suffering. "Last Tuesday I was sitting outside that grocery store, hungry and hopeless. I'd been there for hours watching people walk by, pretending I didn't exist." Thomas's voice grew stronger. "Then this little girl came up to me. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look disgusted. She looked at me like I was a person." The judge leaned forward, completely absorbed in his testimony. "She said, 'You look really hungry, sir.' 'I'll be right back.' And she went into that store and came back with sandwiches and a bottle of water. She sat down next to me right there on the dirty sidewalk, and we ate together." Thomas paused, struggling with his emotions. "She asked, me about my life, not in a nosy way, but like she genuinely cared. When I told her I used to be a teacher, her whole face lit up. She said, "My grandma says teachers are heroes because they help people learn." And then she asked if I missed it. The prosecutor's expression had completely changed. The stern mask had slipped, revealing someone moved by the unexpected turn of events. "No one had treated me with dignity in 2 years," Thomas continued, his voice breaking. "This child, this 7-year-old girl, saw past my circumstances to my humanity. She didn't see a homeless man to be feared or pitied. She saw someone who was hungry and needed help." Judge Williams had to clear her throat before speaking. "What happened after you ate together?" "She told me she had to go back to her grandma, but before she left she did something I'll never forget." Thomas looked directly at Lucy, who was now sitting on the edge of her seat. "She hugged me. A real hug. And she said, 'I see you.' Not just 'I see you there,' but 'I see you.' Like she understood that being seen, really seen, was what I needed most." The silence in the courtroom was profound. Margaret watched as several people in the gallery wiped their eyes, including the stenographer and the bailiff. Lucy tugged on Margaret's sleeve. "Grandma," she whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "did I do something wrong?" Before Margaret could answer, Judge Williams spoke directly to Lucy. "Sweetheart, would you like to tell me why you took those sandwiches?" Lucy stood up still, clutching Mr. Buttons, and walked to the front of the judge's bench. Her voice was small but clear. "He looked sad and hungry. My grandma always says we should help people when they're sad. She makes me sandwiches when I'm sad, so I thought maybe sandwiches would help him not be sad anymore." The judge had to pause to compose herself. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler than it had been all morning. "Lucy, did you know it was wrong to take things without paying?" Lucy nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am. But Mr. Mitchell looked so hungry, and I had my lunch money, but the storeman was busy, and I didn't want Mr. Mitchell to be hungry while I waited." Thomas stood up from the witness stand. "Your Honor, if I may, what this child did was more valuable than any sandwich. She gave me hope. She reminded me that kindness still exists in this world." Judge Williams looked around the courtroom, her gaze settling on each person present. "In 30 years on the bench, I've seen countless cases of theft, violence, and human cruelty. Today, I'm looking at a 7-year-old girl who saw someone suffering and acted not with malice or selfishness, but with pure compassion." She turned to the prosecutor. "Counselor, do you wish to proceed with these charges?" The prosecutor stood slowly, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "No, Your Honor. The state moves to dismiss all charges." The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to release all the tension that had been building in the room. Lucy looked confused, not understanding the legal proceedings, but sensing that something important had changed. Margaret knelt down and gathered her granddaughter into her arms, feeling the rigid fear finally leave the child's small body. "You're okay, sweetheart. You're going to be okay." But even as relief flooded through her, Margaret knew that the damage of the past week would take time to heal. The trust that had been broken, the innocence that had been questioned, the way Lucy had learned that kindness could be punished. These were wounds that wouldn't heal overnight. The ride home was quiet. Lucy sat in her car seat, staring out the window at the Chicago streets rolling by. Margaret kept glancing in the rearview mirror, trying to read her granddaughter's expression. "Grandma." Lucy's voice was barely above, a whisper. "Yes, baby. If helping people makes them angry, and should I stop?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. In that moment she realized that the real crime hadn't been taking a few sandwiches. It had been teaching a child to doubt the value of compassion. "No, Lucy. Never stop being kind. But sometimes—" Margaret searched for words that a 7-year-old could understand. "Sometimes grown-ups get scared when they see something they don't understand. Your kindness scared them because it showed them something they had forgotten about themselves. Have you ever experienced being punished for doing the right thing, or know someone who has? Share your thoughts in the comments below." Over the next few weeks, something remarkable began to happen. The local newspaper picked up the story, and letters started arriving at Margaret's apartment, dozens of them from strangers who had been moved by Lucy's act of kindness. Teachers wrote about students who had shown similar compassion. Parents shared stories of their own children's generous hearts. Homeless individuals wrote to thank Lucy for seeing them as human beings worthy of dignity, but perhaps the most significant letter came from Judge Williams herself. In elegant handwriting on official court letterhead, she had written, "Dear Lucy, thank you for reminding all of us that justice without compassion is just cruelty with rules. Your kindness in that courtroom showed us what the law should aspire to protect, not just order, but the very best of human nature. Never stop seeing people the way you saw Mr. Mitchell. The world needs more hearts like yours." Lucy read the letter with Margaret's help, sounding out the bigger words with the concentration of someone decoding a treasure map. When they finished, she looked up with eyes that were starting to sparkle again. "Does this mean I did good, Grandma?" "You did the most good anyone did that whole week, sweetheart." But the aftermath wasn't entirely positive. David remained unmoved by the attention and praise his daughter had received. If anything, the media coverage seemed to embarrass him further. He began limiting Lucy's visits to Margaret's apartment, claiming he needed to protect her from further bad influences. The calls between Margaret and her son became increasingly strained. She pleaded with him to see what everyone else could see, that Lucy had demonstrated extraordinary empathy and moral courage. But David remained fixed in his position that the child needed to learn about real-world consequences. One evening, as Margaret was helping Lucy with her homework during one of their increasingly rare visits, the phone rang. It was Thomas Mitchell. "Mrs. Patterson, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the court clerk. I wanted to thank you properly for what your granddaughter did for me." Margaret invited him over for dinner the following Sunday, and Lucy's face lit up when she saw him walk through the door. He looked different, cleaner, more hopeful, and he carried a wrapped package under his arm. "I got a job," he announced, proudly. "Assistant teaching position at a community college. Part-time to start, but it's a beginning." He handed the package to Lucy, who unwrapped it carefully to reveal a children's book about kindness and helping others. Inside the front cover, he had written, "To Lucy, who taught a teacher the most important lesson of all. Thank you for seeing me." As they sat around Margaret's small dining table, sharing a simple meal of pot roast and mashed potatoes, Thomas told them more about his journey. The day Lucy had shared her lunch with him had been a turning point. Her simple act of kindness had reminded him that he was still a person worth saving, still capable of contributing something valuable to the world. "I've been clean for 3 weeks now," he said, his voice steady with quiet pride. "Got into a transitional housing program, started looking for work, all because a little girl reminded me that I was still worth something." Lucy listened with the serious attention she usually reserved for bedtime stories, occasionally asking questions that showed her growing understanding of how profoundly she had affected someone's life. The evening was so pleasant that Margaret almost managed to forget about the ongoing tension with David. But reality came crashing back when he arrived unexpectedly to pick up Lucy, clearly agitated by the presence of a stranger in his mother's apartment. "What's he doing here?" David demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion and barely controlled anger. Margaret tried to explain, but David cut her off. "I don't want some homeless drug addict around my daughter." Thomas stood up calmly, extending his hand. "I'm Thomas Mitchell. I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," David snapped, refusing the handshake. "You're the reason my daughter has a criminal record." "Actually, sir, the charges were dropped completely. Lucy has no record of any kind." But David wasn't interested in facts. His mind was made up, his narrative set in stone. He grabbed Lucy's backpack and jacket, his movements sharp and angry. "Come on, Lucy. We're leaving." Lucy looked between her father and Thomas, confusion and sadness clouding her young features. "But Daddy, Mr. Mitchell was telling me about being a teacher." "Now, Lucy." As they reached the door, Lucy broke free from her father's grip and ran, back to hug Margaret and then Thomas. "I'll see you again, won't I, Mr. Mitchell?" Thomas knelt down to her level. "I hope so, Lucy. And remember what we talked about. Never stop being kind no matter what anyone tells you." After they left, Margaret and Thomas sat in the sudden quiet of the apartment. The weight of the confrontation hung heavy in the air. "I'm sorry," Margaret said finally. He's not usually, well, actually, I guess he is usually like that lately. I don't know what happened to the boy I raised." Thomas poured himself another cup of coffee, his movements thoughtful. Hurt people, Mrs. Patterson, and sometimes the people we love most bear the brunt of our pain. But this latest confrontation had consequences Margaret hadn't anticipated. David's visits became even more infrequent, and when Lucy did come over, she seemed subdued, cautious about mentioning anything that might upset her father. One Tuesday afternoon, as Margaret was helping Lucy with a school project about community helpers, the child suddenly looked up with eyes full of worry. "Grandma, is it bad that I still think about Mr. Mitchell? Daddy says I should forget about—" "What happened?" Margaret set down her coffee cup and pulled Lucy onto her lap, the same way she had when Lucy was smaller and needed comfort after a nightmare. "Lucy, baby, what you did for Mr. Mitchell was beautiful. It was brave and kind and exactly what someone with a good heart does when they see suffering." "But Daddy says—" "Your daddy is scared," Margaret interrupted gently. "Sometimes when people are scared, they say things that aren't true. But you have something special inside you, something that sees when people are hurting and wants to help. Don't let anyone, not even your daddy, convince you that's wrong." Lucy was quiet for a long moment, processing this, with the seriousness of someone much older. Finally, she looked up at Margaret, with eyes that held a new kind of determination. "I want to keep being kind, Grandma, even if it makes people mad." Margaret felt her heart swell with pride and heartbreak in equal measure. This child, this beautiful, empathetic soul, was learning lessons about courage and integrity that many adults never mastered. The breakthrough came in an unexpected way. 3 months after the court hearing, Lucy's teacher, Mrs. Henderson, called Margaret with a request. The second-grade class was working on a unit about community service, and Lucy had suggested they do something to help homeless people in their neighborhood. "She's been quite persistent about it," Mrs. Henderson explained with a chuckle. "She's organized several of her classmates to bring in extra sandwiches from their lunches to share with people they see who might be hungry. I thought you should know, and frankly, I think it's wonderful. She's showing real leadership qualities." That evening, when David came to pick up Lucy, she was bursting with excitement about her class project. For a moment, Margaret saw a flicker of pride in her son's eyes before the familiar walls went back up. "Lucy, you need to focus on your schoolwork, not on—" He paused, searching for words. "Not on things that aren't your responsibility." "But Daddy, Mrs. Henderson says it's called civic duty. That means helping our community as part of being a good citizen." David looked at his daughter, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in months. Margaret held her breath, hoping against hope that he might finally see what everyone else could see. "Your teacher said that," Lucy nodded enthusiastically. "And she says what I did for Mr. Mitchell was exemplary. That means really, really good." For just a moment, David's expression softened. But then, as if remembering himself, the hardness returned. "Just be careful, okay? Don't go talking to strangers." It wasn't the breakthrough Margaret had hoped for, but it wasn't a complete rejection either. It was something, a crack in the wall that David had built around his heart. The real change came in the most ordinary of moments. Margaret was at the grocery store, the same Morrison's where this whole journey had begun, when she overheard a conversation between 2 mothers in the cereal aisle. "Did you see that story in the Tribune about the little girl who fed the homeless man?" one was saying. "It made me think about how I'm raising my kids. Are we teaching them to be kind or just to be safe?" "I know," the other replied. "My daughter asked me why we don't help the people holding signs on street corners. I didn't know what to tell her." Margaret continued shopping, but the conversation stayed with her. That evening she called Thomas, who had become a regular part of their lives despite David's objections. "I think Lucy has started something bigger than we realized," she told him. "People are talking. They're thinking about how they treat others." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "She did that for me too. Made me think about who I wanted to be, not just who circumstances had made me become." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Margaret opened it to find David standing there looking more uncertain than she had seen him in years. "Mum, we need to talk." He sat down at her kitchen table, the same one where he had slammed his fist in anger months ago. but now his hands were still folded in front of him like he was praying. "I've been thinking about what happened, about what Lucy did." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. "Her teacher called me today. She wants to nominate Lucy for some kind of community service award." Margaret waited, sensing that this was David's moment to speak without interruption. "Mrs. Henderson told me about the project Lucy started, about how other kids are following her example. She said—" His voice caught slightly. "She said Lucy shows exceptional moral leadership for someone her age." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken pain and misunderstanding. "I was scared, Mum. When I got that call about Lucy being arrested, I was terrified that she was going to end up like me, making mistakes, facing consequences, being judged." David looked up at Margaret with eyes that suddenly looked very young. "But she wasn't making a mistake, was she? She was being everything I've failed to be." Margaret reached across the table and took her son's hand. "You're not a failure, David. You're human. You made choices based on fear instead of love. But that doesn't make you a bad person." "I've been so angry for so long," he admitted. "Angry at Dad for leaving, angry at you for struggling, angry at myself for not being able to fix everything. And when Lucy got in trouble for being kind, it felt like the world was telling me I was right to be angry, right to be hard. But she kept being kind anyway. Even when I told her not to. Even when I made her feel bad about it, she kept seeing the good in people." David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Including me, apparently. She still lights up when I come to pick her up, even though I've been such a scared father who loves his daughter," Margaret finished gently. They sat together in the gathering dusk, years of hurt and misunderstanding finally beginning to heal. Outside, the Chicago streets hummed with their usual evening activity, but inside Margaret's small apartment, something precious was being rebuilt. When Lucy bounded through the door an hour later, fresh from a playdate with a school friend, she stopped short at seeing her father still there. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. "Hi, Daddy. Are you staying for dinner?" David looked at his mother, then back at his daughter. "If Grandma doesn't mind, I'd like that very much." As Margaret bustled around the kitchen preparing an impromptu family dinner, she listened to David and Lucy talking, really talking, for the first time in months. He asked about her school project, about her friends, about her dreams and fears. And Lucy, with the resilience of childhood, opened her heart to him again. "Daddy," she said, as they sat down to eat, "I want to tell you about Mr. Mitchell. He's really nice, and he knows lots of stories about history because he used to be a teacher." Instead of cutting her off, David leaned forward. "Tell me about him, sweetheart." And she did. She told him about Thomas's journey from despair to hope, about how a simple act of sharing food had rippled outward to change multiple lives. She spoke with the wisdom of someone who had learned that kindness was not weakness, but strength. After dinner, as David was getting ready to leave, he turned to Margaret. "Mom, I owe you an apology, a big one. You didn't fail raising me. I failed to appreciate what you taught me. And you didn't spoil Lucy. You gave her the greatest gift possible. You taught her to love without conditions." Margaret hugged her son for the first time in years, really hugged him, and felt the rigid walls between them finally crumble. 6. Months later, Margaret stood in the auditorium of Lucy's school, watching her granddaughter receive the Mayor's Youth Service Award. Thomas sat beside her now, working full-time as a substitute teacher and living in his own small apartment. David sat on Margaret's other side, beaming with pride, as the Mayor described Lucy's initiative that had inspired dozens of other children to start their own kindness projects throughout the city. "Sometimes," the Mayor said into the microphone, "the smallest acts of compassion create the biggest changes. Lucy Patterson saw someone who needed help, and instead of looking away, she acted. Her courage to care has inspired our entire community to look at homelessness differently, to see the human dignity in every person, regardless of their circumstances." Lucy stood on the stage in her best dress, a new one that David had bought, especially for the occasion, holding a certificate that proclaimed her a community champion. She looked out into the audience and found Margaret's face giving her the same gap-toothed smile that had always made Margaret feel like sunshine. After the ceremony, as families milled around taking pictures and sharing congratulations, Thomas approached Lucy with a special gift, a small pin shaped like a heart. "This is for you," he said, kneeling down to her level. "It's to remind you that kindness is always the right choice, even when it's difficult." Lucy pinned it carefully to her dress, then looked up at him with eyes full of wisdom beyond her years. "Mr. Mitchell, are you happy now?" Thomas smiled, the kind of smile that reaches all the way to someone's soul. "Yes, Lucy. Thanks to you, I'm happy now." As they walked out of the school together, 3 generations of a family that had learned to heal, plus the friend who had become part of that family through the simple power of shared compassion, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since that terrible Tuesday afternoon. The charges had been dropped, but more importantly, the love had been restored. Lucy continued to see the world through eyes of kindness, but now she also had the support and understanding of everyone who mattered to her. David had learned to channel his protective instincts into encouragement rather than fear, and Margaret had discovered that the values she had tried to instill in her family weren't just pretty ideals. They were powerful forces capable of transforming lives. That evening, as they sat around Margaret's dinner table sharing a celebratory meal, Lucy looked around at the faces of the people who loved her and made an announcement. "I want to keep helping people," she said, with the seriousness of someone making a life-changing decision. "Not just homeless people, but anyone who's sad or hungry or lonely, because everyone deserves to be seen." Margaret reached over and squeezed her granddaughter's hand. "That sounds like a wonderful way to live, sweetheart." And it was. In the years that followed, Lucy grew up to become exactly the kind of person her 7-year-old self had promised she would be. Someone who saw suffering and acted to alleviate. It's someone who understood that kindness was not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be cultivated. The little girl who had been arrested for feeding a homeless man had become a young woman who dedicated her life to feeding hope wherever she found despair. And in doing so, she proved that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to look away from another person's pain. Margaret kept the judge's letter framed on her kitchen wall next to Lucy's award certificate and a photo of their family with Thomas. Visitors would often ask about the collection, and Margaret would tell them the story of how a sandwich shared in love had changed multiple lives and reminded an entire community that justice without compassion is just cruelty with rules. The story became part of Lucy's school curriculum, used to teach children about civic responsibility and moral courage. Thomas eventually became a full-time teacher again, often sharing Lucy's example with his students when discussing what it means to be a good citizen. And David, who had once been so afraid of his daughter's kindness, became her biggest supporter, helping her organize food drives and volunteer activities throughout her teenage years. On quiet Tuesday afternoons, when Margaret would iron her pale yellow blouse and wait for Lucy to visit, she would sometimes think about that terrible phone call that had started it all. She realized now that it hadn't been the beginning of a tragedy, but the beginning of a transformation that had taught them all that love is not just an emotion. It's a choice you make every day, especially when that choice is difficult. The girl who had fed hope to a stranger had ended up nourishing the souls of everyone around her, proving that kindness, like ripples in a pond, spreads far beyond its point of origin to touch shores we never imagined it could reach. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.